Welcome to Psalms, Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we will walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 119. These are issues that anyone doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 119, the top 3 issues are the meaning of Torah in Psalm 119, the grammar and meaning of Psalm 119, verse 126, and the cohesion of Psalm 119, verses 41 through 48. The first of our top exegetical issues in Psalm 119 is the meaning of Torah in Psalm 119. The word Torah occurs with noticeable frequency throughout Psalm 119, 25 times. Whenever we see this word, therefore, it's important that what comes to our mind is as close as possible to what would have come to the mind of an original reader. We can group our options under 2 broad meanings. Let's use verse 1 to illustrate. The Hebrew text of Psalm 119:1 says, Ashrei thmimei dare, haholchim b'thorath Adonai. The first half says, happy are those whose way is blameless. Literally, happy are the blameless of way. The second half says, those who walk in the Torah of the Lord, b'thorath Adonai. How is Torah translated? The ESV translates the second half as, who walk in the law of the Lord, while the NJPS translates the second half as, who follow the teaching of the Lord. Our first option is therefore something like Torah, meaning law, in which case the word would have brought to mind the entire legal apparatus in ancient Israel, and therefore referred to the Mosaic law given at Sinai. Our second option is something like Torah, meaning teaching, in which case the word would have brought to mind all of God's revelation, and therefore would have a more general reference. Let's look at the evidence for each option. One good piece of evidence for Torah, meaning law, and therefore referring to the Mosaic law, is the poem's genre. Psalm 119, like Psalms 1 and Psalm 19, is a Torah psalm. Torah psalms, like those of 1 and 19, give us a glimpse into what it looked like for a king of Israel to fulfill his command to meditate on the law God gave Moses. We read about this command in Deuteronomy 17. Beginning in verse 18, the passage commands that the king shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life. If, therefore, Psalm 119 is meant to reflect a king's reflection on the Mosaic law, like we see in Psalms 1 and Psalm 19, the word Torah must then refer to this Mosaic law. The big problem with this argument is that Psalm 119 was most likely composed after Israel returned from the Babylonian exile, at a time when there was no king. Comparing Psalm 119 to Psalms 1 and 19, which were composed by David, is thus not a valid comparison, and so one cannot read the meaning that Torah has in those Davidic psalms into this non-Davidic psalm, especially when the meaning of Torah in those Davidic psalms is tied so closely to the office of king. Some have tried to argue that there are clues in the psalm that Torah specifically refers to something written. For example, verse 18 says, Gal einai va'abita niflaot mitorathecha. Open my eyes that I may behold wondrous things out of your law. Here, the psalmist seems to be talking about something he is physically looking at, which would suggest a written document such as the Mosaic law. The problem with this argument is that there are also very clear indications in the psalm that Torah is something that is heard as well as written. The first part of verse 72 says, Tov li thorat picha, which we have translated, the Torah which proceeds from your mouth is better for me. The scope of the phrase thorat picha, the Torah which proceeds from your mouth, is plainly interpreted as encompassing all of God's communicative acts, not simply those that are written down. Some may point to other key words in the psalm that have legal connotations, such as mishpat, rules or judgments, or pikud, precepts, as evidence that Torah should also have legal connotations. While this may be true, that is, that some keywords have specific legal connotations, there are other keywords in the psalm that go well beyond the scope of referring strictly to legislation. the psalmist repeatedly refers to God's promise, imra, as well as God's word, davar. For example, in verse 38, we read, Hakem le'avdecha imrathecha. Fulfill for your servant your promise, imrathecha. And in verse 42, we read, Batachti bidvarecha. I trust in your word, dvarecha. These examples show that an original reader would have been thinking of all of God's revelation to his people, not just the legal ones. The final problem with understanding Torah as law is that there are correlations we would expect to find in connection with law that are simply absent in the psalm. First, the psalm never uses the word brith, covenant, which would naturally lead a reader to think of the covenant at Sinai. Second, with only a few exceptions, references to the Mosaic law in books that were composed or edited after the exile use specific words and phrases, none of which are found in Psalm 119. For example, in Nehemiah 8:14, we read the phrase, Kathuv b'Torah, asher tziva Adonai b'yad Moshe, written in the law that the Lord had commanded Moses. And in 2 Chronicles 25:4, the passage explicitly calls the law the Sefer Moshe, Book of Moses. Examples could be multiplied. The second option for interpreting Torah is to understand it as referring to all of God's communicative acts and revelations. As we saw earlier, the NJPS captures this meaning well with the English gloss teachings. All the counter-evidence to interpreting Torah as law given above simultaneously support this position. But two pieces of evidence in particular strengthen the position that the denotation of Torah goes well beyond the legal domain. One is a strong intertextual link with Abraham. The first time that the word Torah is used in the Bible is applied to Abraham. In Genesis 26:5, God tells Isaac that he will be blessed because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws, vatorothai. This is significant because in another place, God tells Abraham to walk, hithalech, walk before me and be blameless, thamim. If we then turn to Psalm 119 verse 1, we find almost identical language. The happiness of those blameless in their way, tmimei darech, of those walking, haholchim, in the instruction, Torath, of the Lord. Psalm 119 verse 1 here seems to be alluding to Abraham as an example. Abraham obeyed God's Torah long before the law was given to Moses at Sinai, and so something like instruction must be intended. By virtue of the connection between the two passages, this broader meaning is thus operative within the psalm. A second clue that Torah's meaning has expanded here comes from a comparison with a verse in Jeremiah. In Psalm 119, verse 85, we read, Arrogant people have dug pits, shichot, which is not done according to your instruction, kathorathecha. The Mosaic law says nothing about shichot, pits, however. The next time we hear about it is in Jeremiah 18, verse 22. For they have dug a pit, shicha, to take me. If the psalmist intended for Torah to refer specifically to the Mosaic law, we would expect to find something in the law about shichot, pits, such that he could utter the qualification made in Psalm 119, verse 85. Thus, on evidence of the psalm's date, wider context, and its intertextual allusions, we argue that the psalmist is meditating on and delighting in, and invites others to meditate on and delight in, all of the Lord's acts of communicative instruction, both written and spoken. We have chosen the gloss instruction for RCBC. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation an A rating. The second issue is the grammar and meaning of Psalm 119, verse 126. The Hebrew text of Psalm 119, verse 126 says, Eith le'asot la'Adonai, heferu torathecha. The second half of the verse, heferu torathecha, means your law is being broken. The first half of the verse literally says, time to act blank. The part left untranslated is the prepositional phrase l'Adonai, which consists of the preposition la, which means to or for, plus the divine name. The function of this la has been interpreted in four major ways. For the remainder of this issue, We will review each option and argue for our preferred interpretation. The first option is to interpret the preposition la as marking a vocative phrase. We see this interpretation clearly in the NIV translation. It is time for you to act, Lord, l'Adonai. Your law is being broken. One piece of evidence for this interpretation is that a few ancient versions interpret it this way. Jerome clearly has the vocative form Domine, Lord, as does a Greek reviser, Kyrie, Lord. Beyond this, however, this interpretation begins to encounter difficulties. Some may try to argue for the vocative here on the basis that a second person address to the Lord is quite consistent throughout the psalm. While this may be true, it does not therefore follow that the Lord must be addressed in the second person in every instance. Further to this point, every other time the Lord is addressed with a vocative, it is with a bare vocative. That is, just the divine name is used with nothing before it in the Hebrew. We see this, for example, in verse 12. Blessed are you, O Lord, which is just Adonai. And see also the many other places in the psalm where this happens. A final argument for this interpretation is the existence of a vocative lamed in the first place. This use of lamed is usually cited in order to avoid sudden person shifts. For example, if we accept vocative lamed, we can read Psalm 33 verse 1 as, Shout for joy, righteous ones, to the Lord. Praise benefits, O upright ones, la yesharim. Instead of, Shout for joy in the Lord, O you righteous. Praise befits the upright, la yesharim. But the assumption behind this correction is questionable. Abrupt person shifts are common in the Psalms and don't necessarily need correcting. In verse 57 of this psalm, that is Psalm 119, for example, we have a clear case of an unproblematic person shift. It says, My lot is the Lord. I intend to keep your words. The second major option for interpreting l'Adonai is to analyze the la as introducing the person who will benefit from the action, that is, the benefactor. This is seen in the NJPS translation. It is time to act for the Lord, l'Adonai. This interpretation does indeed have a couple of strengths. First, in another post-exilic passage, we see people acting for the Lord in that they take matters into their own hands. In Nehemiah 13:17, Nehemiah confronts lawbreakers, and he says, Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Second, one could argue that the most straightforward reading of the preposition la after the verb asa, to do, is benefactive. That is, to read the construction as to do for. This is true, however, only when the sentence has a grammatical object, i.e. only when the construction is to do something for, la. We see this, for example, in Exodus 12:48. Va'asa Pesach la Adonai, and would keep the Passover to the Lord. Our clause here in Psalm 119:126 would lack a grammatical object under the benefactive interpretation. A literal reading of Et la'asot la'Adonai under the benefactive interpretation would yield time to act for the Lord. The benefactive interpretation also has a major problem when considering the next verse of the psalm. The first line of Psalm 119 verse 127 says, Therefore, al kain, I love your commandments. If we read Et la'asot la'Adonai as something like it is time to act for the Lord, it would then make little logical sense for the psalmist to then say, Therefore, I love your commandments, as if acting for the Lord came first and loving him came second, instead of the other way around. One could read the lamed here as marking possession, that is, as saying something like, a time to act belongs to the Lord. We find a similar phrase in Jeremiah 51, verse 6. Et nikama hi l'Adonai could be read as, the time of vengeance belongs to the Lord. The biggest problem with this interpretation, however, is that it simply does not fit the psalm. The implication of the time to act belongs to the Lord is that he will act when he decides to, and the psalmist must therefore trust and wait patiently. This contradicts places in the psalm where the psalmist is explicitly pleading with the Lord to act. For example, in Psalm 119 verse 122, the psalmist cries out, Take responsibility for your servant, for my good. The final option is to interpret the lamed as a lamed of experience, that is, as introducing the one who is doing the acting. This interpretation is reflected in the ESV's translation. It is time for the Lord, l'Adonai, to act. This function of lamed is well attested. For example, in Ecclesiastes 9:2, we find the clause, Mikre echad latzadik velarasha. Literally, there is one fate for the righteous, latzadik, and for the wicked, larasha, which means that the righteous and the wicked experience the same fate. In one case of the lamed of experience, the experiencer is an apposition to a subject pronoun, showing that the referent is the agent of the following action. In Haggai 1:4, we read, Ha'et lachem atem lashevet bevatechem sfunim. It is a time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses. Analyzing the lamed as introducing the experiencer, and therefore the one doing the acting, is also much more well suited for the logical connection in the following verse. If in verse 126 the psalmist declares, it is time for the Lord to act, then the beginning of verse 127 follows much more naturally. Therefore, al-ken, I love your commandments. The psalmist's love for the Lord is a natural response to the Lord acting on the psalmist's behalf. Finally, understanding eit leasot la'Adonai to mean it is time for the Lord to act fits perfectly within the surrounding verses, which are dominated by requests for the Lord to act. In verse 122, for example, the psalmist cries out, take responsibility for your servant, for my good. And examples abound in verses 121 through 128. On syntactic and contextual grounds, we therefore understand the lamed in the phrase la'Adonai to introduce the experiencer, and therefore the one doing the acting. Thus, et la'asot la'Adonai would literally mean or the time to act is experienced by God, which further means that God is the one doing the acting. We have therefore preferred to translate this clause as, it's time for the Lord to act. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The third issue is the cohesion of Psalm 119, verses 41 through 48. These verses make up the wow section of the acrostic, and every verse begins with the conjunction wow, which means and in Hebrew, an obvious candidate for meeting the requirements of the acrostic. How are we to understand the logical connection between these simple ands? That the wows in verses 42 and 44 express the result of the requests of the psalmist in verses 41 and 43. Verse 41 starts, now let your loyal acts come, vayavouni chasadecha. And verse 42 gives the purpose, so that I will answer, va'e'eneh. Another request opens verse 43, and do not take true words out of my mouth, va'al tatzel mipi dvar emet, with verse 44 giving the purpose, so that I will keep your instruction. Va'eshmara toratcha. The connection between the wows in verses 45 through 48 is more controversial. Morphologically, the form is made up of a simple wow plus a yiktol, which itself may be interpreted in different ways. Let us look at each of the major three options in more detail. The first option is to simply interpret the conjunction wow as and, with no further nuance. Under this interpretation, one therefore interprets the following yiktols with all the options available were the wow not there. Taking the first verbs in verses 45, va'ethalcha, and 46, va'adabra, as an example, this interpretation is reflected in the NET, which translates both as simple futures. I will be secure, va'ethalcha barachava. I will speak, va'adabra. It is also reflected in the REB, which translates the first verb as present habitual and the second as expressing obligation. I walk in freedom, va'ethalcha barachava. I shall speak, va'adabra. Let's look at the evidence for this interpretation. The best evidence for this interpretation is that it makes room for a present habitual reading of these verbs, which fits well with other statements in the psalm. For example, the REB translates va'eshta'asha in verse 47 as I will find continuing delight. This same idea of habitually finding delight is present in many other places in the psalm, even with different forms. I delight, sha'ashati, in your instruction, verse 70. Your commands are my delight. Sha'ashu'ai, verse 143. Your law is my delight. Sha'ashu'ai, verse 174. A present habitual reading, however, is not appropriate for other actions within this section when considering the context of the whole psalm. For example, it is unlikely that the psalmist would say, I walk in freedom, ve'etalcha v'rachava, when throughout the rest of the psalm he speaks of his present suffering, as in verse 25, my life sticks to the dust, and verse 107, I am utterly afflicted. The second option is to interpret the verbs as past tense, in which case the verb forms could either still be read as wow plus yiktols or vayiktols. This interpretation is supported by the LXX, which translates most of the verbs with imperfects, thereby reflecting a past habitual meaning. The verbs in verses 45 and 46, for example, are translated as, and I would walk, eporevomen, and I would speak, elalun. The verb in verse 48 reflects a past perfective with its use of the Greek aorist. The verb va'esa in Hebrew is translated with the Greek eira, I raised. This interpretation could also fit nicely with its wider section of verses 41 through 48. At the beginning of this section, in verses 41 through 43, the psalmist asks God to give him the words with which to answer his accusers. It would make sense if the psalmist then cited as support ways in the past he obeyed God. And I would speak va'adabra about your testimonies, in verse 46, and I would delight va'eshta'asha in your commands. Nevertheless, since a resultative reading is agreed upon in verse 44, so that I will keep va'eshmara, it is hard to accept that there would be an abrupt shift to the past in the very next verse with the exact same verb form in the exact same position. This brings us to our preferred interpretation. If we read the vav plus yiktol constructions as expressing result, that is, so that, this maintains continuity with verse 44, which, again, most would agree is also expressing result semantics. Thus, verses 43 through 45 would read, and do not take true words out of my mouth, so that I will keep va'eshmara, your instruction, so that I will live at ease, va'ethalcha v'rachava. This interpretation also fits nicely within the context of the section. If the Lord provides the psalmist with truthful words, the result will be that he will be free to keep va'eshmara, God's instruction, live va'ethalcha, speak about God's testimonies before kings, va'edabra, delight in God's commandments, va'eshta'asha, and so on. Finally, the resultative reading works well syntactically. Recall that verses 41 and 43 consist of requests, that is, jussive forms, vivo uni, let such and such come to me, and va'al tatzel, do not take, respectively. Whenever vav plus yiktol follows a jussive, the most natural reading is a purpose or result clause. This may be illustrated in verse 27 of this psalm. In the first line, the psalmist cries out, give me understanding of the way of your precept. Derech pikudecha havineni. In the second line, we have the verb va'asicha, which the ancient reviser Symmachus explicitly translates as a purpose/result clause. Hina diegesomai, that I may narrate. Thus, when considering the context as a whole and the expected verbal syntax, it is most likely that these vav plus yiktols should be taken as introducing result clauses. We have therefore preferred to translate these verbs in verses 45 through 48 as follows. Verse 45, va'ethalcha, is translated, so that I will live. Verse 46, va'adabra, is translated, so that I will speak. Verse 47, va'eshta'asha, so that I will delight. Verse 48a, va'esa, so that I will commit. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, we would give this interpretation an A rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. Issue 1 shapes how we see what exactly the psalmist is meditating on throughout the psalm. Issue 2 offers a solution to a difficult verse that contributes to the overall tone of the psalm, a part of which involves the psalmist pleading with God. Issue 3 offers a cohesive interpretation of the vav section of the acrostic that also embeds it within the larger concerns of the psalm. It also reveals the intentionality behind the vavs, that they are more than simply a letter used to fill out the acrostic. Rather, they serve a crucial function for understanding the flow of that section. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 119, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our poetry video explores the beauty of the psalm as a poem. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at scriptura.org to learn more.